Today we're going to talk about the economics topic protectionism. In order to talk about protectionism, we need to look at the three different types of protectionism. The first type of protectionism is tariffs. A tariff is a tax that is put on imported goods. For example, the United States might put a tax on the grain that is imported into a country. This would be a tariff. The next type of protectionism that we're going to look at is subsidies. A subsidy is an amount that's paid by the government per unit of output to the producer. So for example, Denmark, they might pay out 1 crown for each kilo of grain that a Danish farmer produces. A quota is a limit on the number of goods that can be imported into a country. For example, Sweden might put a limit on the amount of grain or wheat that they want to import into their country. There are several reasons for protectionism. The first one that we're going to look at today is to protect the domestic industries from low-cost labor. This is a topic that's been discussed lately a lot in the media. For example, that a lot of firms have been having a hard time trying to compete with overseas competitors, especially from China, where they're able to work at a much lower price than the ones in, for example, the EU. For example, introducing a subsidy, it means that the local producers in a country where they'll be more well paid than compared to the low-cost labor, they'll be able to protect them in this form. The second reason for protectionism that we're going to look at is to avoid the risk of over-specialization. For example, if they go into an infant industry, they can subsidy, for they'll be able to compete with overseas markets for this new product instead of just going into producing primary products. The third reason that we're going to look at for the reasons for protectionism is to prevent dumping. For example, there's been a lot of talks of the EU dumping grain into Africa. A way that they can prevent dumping is that they can put a quota on the amount that should be imported into the country, and therefore they'll prevent this dumping. Dumping just means that a country is providing a product lower than the market price, and therefore the domestic producers are not able to compete with it. The last reason for protectionism that we're going to look at is to protect product standards. For example, there's been dispute over EU imposing measures to protect product standards. For example, the product standards in Asia might be different from the ones in EU, and therefore they will prevent products that they don't see as safe to be imported into the EU. The first argument that we're going to look at against protectionism is that there might be an increase in the price of products. This is because there might be an increase to the consumers and also the producers of the imports that they buy. The components that they'll use to produce their products might increase, and thus it'll increase the final product that they're producing. The second argument that we're going to look at against protectionism is the competition diminishes. For example, if they provide subsidies or quotas or even tariffs to a product, it means that they now won't have to compete with foreign competitors, have an advantage compared to the overseas producers, even though they might not be as effective compared to these. The next reason is inefficient use of world resources. This is sort of what I mentioned just before, because now that if a subsidy is provided to an American producer who might not be as efficient, it means that world resources are being used inefficiently, because now it's an American producer who can't produce it as efficiently as a Chinese producer, for example. It can also be because the American producer might become ineffective because there's a lack of competition, as mentioned just before, and therefore he might not have the same incentive to work harder, as there's not the same amount of competition anymore. The last reason is that it may hinder economic growth. These are all the reasons listed above. When competition diminishes and when there's an efficient use of world resources and an increase in the price of imports, it can hinder the economic growth within a country. Here we can see that price world is right here. But then when the tariff is introduced, price world is pushed up here. So now, in order to import solar panels, the prices are now pushed up. And that means that now they'll be getting, before they were only getting G, but now they'll get G and H as well, because they'll now be producing here at this point. Before the foreign producers were producing from H to K, but now it means that they'll only be producing IJ. So the domestic producers will produce more and the domestic foreign producers will produce less. And there's an increase in the average price of, in this case, solar panels. To finish the diagram off with tariffs, we can see that there's two triangles that have been created by the imposing of the tariff. The first one is C. C represents the inefficiency of the domestic producers, and it's a loss of world efficiency, and it's being produced by the local producers that, when looking at it from an economic perspective, are less efficient than the domestic producers because they will now not have the same incentive to be competitive as they are protected by the tariff. The other triangle that we can see is F. F is equal to the loss of consumer surplus because the wheat is not purchased now. This is also known as a deadweight loss of welfare because there's this loss of consumer surplus. The next diagram that we're going to look at is subsidies. As mentioned before, a subsidy is an amount of money paid by the government to a producer for each per unit of output. Here we can see that before the price of a product was here, right here, where it cuts this line here, so that was the price world before, but now the producers were receiving this, but now that the subsidy is introduced, the supply line is pushed down here, which means that they'll now be receiving A and B, and it also means that the foreign producers will now only be producing C and D. So here, compared to tariffs, we can see the advantage here is that the price of solar panels won't increase. The price of the solar panels will stay constant. So that means that the producers will receive this, the PW plus the subsidy, but the consumers will still only be paying PW because it is the government that's paying the subsidy. So therefore, it won't have an effect. It won't have a direct effect on the consumers, but indirectly it will, and therefore it is an indirect effect on them because these monies that is now being spent on the subsidy could have been spent on something else, such as schools or medical care. Lastly, we can see this blue triangle here that is created by the subsidy. The blue triangle represents the inefficiency of the domestic producer, and it's also a misallocation of world resources, since more of the world's resources are being used to produce the wheat that are necessary. This is another deadweight loss of welfare. And the last diagram that we're going to look at is quotas. Well, as mentioned here, we can see that the supply line is here at S, and the price is PW right here. But we can see that domestic producers supply OQ1 at a price of PW, and the importers produce their quota of Q1 to Q3. However, once this has happened, there's an excess demand of Q3 and Q2 at the price PW, and so price begins to rise. As the price rises, importers are not allowed to supply more wheat because they are filling their quota, and domestic producers begin to enter the market, and they'll be attracted by the higher prices of wheat as well. The domestic supply curve has, in fact, shifted to the right above PW. Eventually, the price will settle on P quota, right here. At a price of P quota, their revenue will now rise from being only A, which was this part, where demand now equals supply again, and the total quantity of wheat demanded falls to Q4, it's right here, decreased from Q2. Domestic producers will now be producing from 0 to Q1 and from Q3 to Q4. And now it'll go to being A, C, D, F, I, and J. So there's a major increase in what the domestic producers are now profiting. Foreign producers will now supply their quota of Q1 to Q3 tons of wheat, and they'll also receive a price of P quota. The income will now change because before they were selling B, C, D, and E, but now they'll only be selling B, G, and H. This will normally be a fall in income, but it doesn't always have to be this way. We can see that represented by K, this is the consumer surplus because this is now not being purchased. So this is a deadweight loss of welfare because there is this loss of consumer surplus. You can also see the blue triangle here, J, and that is because it is now being produced by inefficient farmers, whereas it could have been produced by the foreign farmers that were more efficient than the local, and therefore this is a loss of world efficiency. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel, IB Exam Revision.